Good morning, everybody. I'm again really happy to have you here to start our last day of the conference. I don't want to say a lot, good morning, and I hope you had a nice evening yesterday and took a bit of rest. And yeah, let's just start with the first panel. And Paweł, Kubicki, the floor is yours first.
Thank you.
Marek? Yeah.
Thank you, Lucas. Good morning. We are starting the last day of our conference with the morning session titled Postcolonial Perspective on Polish History. Unfortunately, we have just only two speakers because one of the speakers, for some personal reasons, couldn't came to Berlin and couldn't join to us. So the first speaker is, excuse me, I need a glass, is Agata Czaja. Agata Czaja is a PhD candidate at Münster University. She's preparing a PhD dissertation dedicated Polish Romanticism through perspective of postcolonial perspective. She completed a BA degree at University of Warsaw, and then she completed MA degree at University of Münster. Agata will be talking about the postcolonialism and violence, question about Polish context. Please, Agata, the floor is yours.
Okay, so as said, I will be talking about violence and postcolonialism, and important remark for the beginning, what I'm going to present here is rather like quite an eclectic overview of the problem, because not a synthesis of a problem, rather a few examples with a few proposals how we could conceptualize this problem and what could it tell us about the specifics of the Polish colonial history. And obviously, my examples are going to come from literature, because literary studies is what I'm based in. So yeah, why I even want to speak about this topic? Simply because colonialism and violence are inseparably interconnected. The phenomena of colonialism unavoidably comes with violence, but also the process of decolonization, of liberation is, as Frantz Fanon has stated in Wretched of the Earth, again, no other but violent. And colonialism, by definition, brings this violence into the daily life of those colonized, both on this level of this physical, bodily damage, as well on this level of hierarchy, discourse, system, education. And I'm going to just, to simplify everything, I'm just going to refer to this type of violence as, let's say, discursive or epistemic forms of violence. And both this epistemic as well as this bodily aspect of violence are simply the most important means of imposing this colonial rule. And quite a lot has already been written and discussed about these implications of colonial violence in the former British and French colonies. And most importantly, obviously, Frantz Fanon was writing about it, and he, in his Wretched of the Earth, for example, clearly presented and very in-depthly analyzed this relationship between racism, colonialism, and violence. However, in the case of Poland, because I am supposed to speak about Poland, this whole situation about, let's say, this hierarchy, this whole epistemic violence is slightly different. Because, as Eva Thompson has stated once, in case of Eastern Europe, this is not the race on which this colonial exclusion is based, but this is national identity. And I believe this statement is already a reason to reformulate basically the whole post-colonial theory when speaking about Eastern Europe. But also it has a lot of implications, I believe, for the topic of violence in the colonial situation. Because when we think about those markers of the identity on which this violence is performed on, they are obviously different in case of the national identity. And yeah, what they could be: language, religion, traditions. Some answers can be brought to us by Polish Romantic literature that I'm also going to analyze here. And yeah, I'm going to speak a little bit about Polish Romantic literature, and then I will move to the 20th century with 2 examples. So yeah, let's get started with this part with examples. Yeah, and first work about which I'm going to speak is Angeli by Juliusz Słowacki, and I have chosen simply this one because it is basically like a walk through various forms of violence, of colonial suppressions in the Siberia, where obviously those Poles were at the time exiled. Yeah, and the young man named Angeli walks accompanied by an old man called Shaman. He walks through Siberia, and they start their walk with these beautiful words: "I will live with this young man so that I may show him many painful things," and he does show him many painful things indeed. For example, the first scene that one of the first scenes they encounter during their walk is a scene when the Eastern Orthodox priest is preaching to a group of Polish children that are wandering through this cold Siberia. And importantly, apart from preaching, he also has multiple breads with him. Yeah, this translation was done by me. It's not particularly good, but the point was to kind of like bring the meaning, not the literally value. So yeah, I understand your faces at the moment. Yeah, and this priest, apart from preaching, has multiple breads with him that he gives to the children, and the shaman is basically very outraged by these pictures and basically like burns down this Orthodox priest. And I believe in this picture multiple forms of both colonial and anti-colonial violence cross with each other. This picture of this Orthodox priest is basically, for me, an example of this violence against national identity, here obviously understood as religion. Słowacki emphasizes that the priest is teaching here the Russian faith and that the Tsar is the head of the faith. You should not rebel against him because that would be very bad, basically against God. And I believe what is actually important in this picture and shows us a certain difference between the Polish situation and the situation of, let's say, this British colonialism is the fact that kind of like the reaction of Słowacki, this like burning down this Orthodox priest, is a certain, so to speak, being scared against this rather like hybrid mode of identity, against this like mimicry of the colonizer, which normally in these theories of Homi Baba is a way to actually like undermine this colonial discourse. And the question is maybe why? I believe this is because of the differences between this like Russian colonial rule and the Western empire, so to speak. Because I think it was already throughout this conference talked about that in case of Russia, it was not that much about establishing this hierarchy and differentiating between, different, so to speak, types of people, but it was rather about erasing the difference. So actually keeping this difference is kind of like the almost existential struggle for those colonized in this case. Importantly, this type of violence, this, so to speak, educational violence, is directed towards children, which is obviously normal because children are usually the target of the educational violence. But importantly, when we think about violence, they are also helpless, basically unable to answer either with any form of, so to speak, subverting the discourse or not to even speak about physical violence. But I think the reaction of the shaman who protects them in this situation is quite important because it's also similar to the one that we encounter in one of the next scene when we don't have to do with children anymore, but with an old man, a former member of Bar Confederation who is one of the oldest ones, first generation of those ever exiled to Siberia by Russia. And this old man is obviously living in very poor conditions, but he's still forced to pay taxes to the Tsar, and then the Russian tax officer, tax collector arrives and demands these taxes from him, but not only the taxes, also the apples from the apple tree standing outside his hut. And then the shaman says the following words to Angeli: go and stand under the apple tree and say nothing to those who shake the tree until the power of God shows itself. And I believe this power of God and also this burning down literally the Orthodox priest is, to me, very similar to what Walter Benjamin was writing about the divine violence. Namely, this divine violence being a pure manifestation, not a mean opposing this legal violence, that is a mean for solidifying this oppressive legal system, and in this case rather colonial system, is obviously this way, kind of like the only way of destroying this oppressive system. And I believe here we don't have to do with the legal system, but with the colonial one. But I believe that Słowacki was seeing that it's all like systemic, and it's the only way to kind of like overcome this type of violence is this, so to speak, divine intervention. Because, interestingly, when we move on to the chapter 7 when he starts speaking about those who are forced to work in the mines of Siberia, the situation changes. Namely, the shaman, when they start their journey into these mines of Siberia, he introduces the place with the following words: "Therefore we shall show no more miracles, nor the power of God which is in us, but we shall weep, for we have gone in unto the men that don't see the sun anymore." So basically, the suggestion is that this physical violence is here kind of like stopping this possibility of this divine intervention. And then Słowacki moves on to describing how much like animalized and degenerated those people who experience this type of violence are. They went like sheep, on the body of the youngest son lie the father like a dog, or like, have you ever met like a native and dated with him gently and humanly? So very clearly Słowacki like emphasizes that this experience of this physical violence, of this like working over basically one's strength being like whipped all the time and stuff, that this very much like degenerated those people. And the issue is, usually, this like discursive figure of animalizing is rather used by the colonizer in order to build a certain hierarchy against the subaltern. But in this case, the subaltern, or at least the voice of the subalterns, is doing this. Why? And I believe this can be connected to the term of recognition about which Frantz Fanon was writing. Frantz Fanon was writing in Black Skin's White Mask about this concept of recognition, and for him it was crucial to overcome the colonialism. It was inseparably connected with him, with this violent anti-colonial struggle, in order then to be mutual and then real. As he was writing, thus human reality in itself, for itself, can be achieved only through conflict and through the risk that conflict implies. This risk means that I go beyond life towards a supreme good, that is the transformation of subjective certainty of my own worth into a universally varied objective truth. And in this case, simply what Słowacki is showing, he is showing that there is not even this subjective certainty of one's own worth anymore because of this experience of the physical violence, not to even speak about any form of resistance that could transform this subjective certainty into some universally varied objective truth. Yeah. And now I will move on to the phenomena of Wallenrodism that I will treat here as a certain form of like subversive anti-colonial struggle. I will refrain from analyzing the exact passages from Mickiewicz's work, and I will focus on certain aspects that Maria Janion has identified about this motif in her book about it. She believes that it presents a certain broader picture, and basically this Konrad Wallenrod is basically for her a figure with which the whole 19th century generation could identify. And basically the most important premise of Wallenrodism can be summed up in one sentence, namely, you're a slave, the only weapon of slave is treason. So basically like, yeah, Konrad Wallenrod, as we all know, this protagonist is a Grand Master of the Teutonic Order, who is actually a Lithuanian, a traitor whose actual goal is to bring the Teutonic Order to fall, even for the price of his honor. And usually this motif is obviously discussed in this context of moral dilemma of this like very honorable protagonist who is subjected to a certain hegemony, and then because of this has to use such deceitful, unhonorable methods to achieve the freedom. But I believe this is also something else. There is not only this problem there. Konrad Wallenrod, as Maria Janion writes, was a certain, like a figure, this Wallenrodism was a certain mode of biography for this 19th century generation that has joined Russian education, was brought up in this Russian education system, then joined Russian army and army academies, but as Janion writes, it was basically mostly like only a mask to actually organize the underground resistance, like November Uprising, January Uprising, and many other forms of physical anti-colonial resistance in this case. And I believe this can be interestingly compared to the subaltern's strategy of mimicry. Because mimicry is obviously the situation when the subaltern is imitating, repeating the behavior, discourse, and culture of the colonizer. However, this always is always marked by a certain difference, and the subaltern is always like almost the same, but not quite, and obviously this leads, by this immanent presence of the other, this leads to a certain subversions in the colonial discourse. But here, interestingly, we start on this level of discourse and institution that the subaltern is joining and masking itself there, but then the subaltern kind of like moves out of this space of only discourse and system, and actually what it is being organized is the like anti-colonial physical resistance, like, yeah, an uprising, usually, in case of Poland. And I believe this is like a very important element of the specifics of the Polish situation, with the obviously whole tradition of this like anti-colonial armed struggle in the forms of usually the uprising. It's obviously a very important, basically like a paradigm of the Polish thinking about the world. And now, I will move to the, it's here. Now I will move to the 20th century, to the Polish People's Republic, exactly speaking. And just importantly, I don't want to delve right now into this discussion whether Polish People's Republic is colonial in the same way in which the partitions were. I believe both of those hegemonical, undoubtedly hegemonical situation need their own methodological reflections and ideas, but I really don't have time to delve into this discussion right now, so I will be just believing that what I'm saying here right now is not based on a simplification. And I will use an example that may seem totally unsuited to this topic, because I will use the poetry of Stanisław Barańczak. And Barańczak belonged to this generation 68 that was known for deconstructing the communist propaganda in their language, and I believe in their poetry. And I believe that this is actually, because in case of Polish People's Republic, this propaganda language was one of the most important kind of like means of the state to kind of like solidify this whole system. And I believe that was basically the discursive violence. And I have not translated this one because it's actually impossible to translate. For those who do not speak Polish, I put the propaganda phrases that he incorporated into his poetry into red. I hope it's like kind of, maybe not understandable, but possible to at least like kind of feel. And yeah, and I believe what he did by incorporating them is actually a hybrid operation in the space of the discourse. As Homi Baba was writing, hybridity is the problematic of colonial representation and individuation that reverses the effects of colonialist disavowal, so that other denied knowledges enter upon the dominant discourse and estrange the basis of its authority, its rules of recognition. But obviously, this is a specific Polish situation, so it needs to be adjusted. How I understand this in context of this situation is that this colonial hegemonical representation of the reality present in this communist propaganda becomes linguistically dislocated through various operations that this poet performs on the Polish language. For example, we can see in the first one, instead of this like rozwój that is normally there's rozbój, for example. However, and he performs all those operations, and they allow him to kind of like enter this colonialist discourse, this dominant discourse, and reverse its meaning. However, this reversing here is a very special operation. Namely, the colonial disavowal was aiming in this case not that much to differentiate between various categories of people, like, build this, like, for example, racial hierarchy. It was rather aiming here, this colonialist discourse, to create a certain alternative reality. This location here is then more about locating this propaganda not in the sterile environment of the state-owned TV or press when it's not questioned, but please let me say it, in this dead of the everyday language that is assigned here of this dead and problems of everyday life. And I believe this puts the whole authority of this discourse in question as it confronts it with difference of the language of the colonized that represents here this reality that is not compatible with the language of the propaganda. And I believe this is where all those effects of doubting and irony and also subverting this colonial discourse come from. Yeah, and now I have to very quickly talk about my last example, which is Mała Apokalipsa by Kubicki. And in this case, we speak about, again, very ambivalent example, because I believe here we can talk about anti-colonial act of self-violence. Because, as we all maybe know, the protagonist of this novel is asked by his friends to undertake an act of self-immolation as a protest against the plans of incorporating Poland into the Soviet Union. With certain hesitations, basically the protagonist agrees to do it. And obviously this, so to speak, self-offering can remind of this romantic ethos of messianic self-offering of the protagonist for the good of the nation. But what is important, the protagonist, I will just speak very quickly about it because I don't have time, the protagonist is constantly kind of like deconstructing the pathos of this act, and it's, so to speak, with this tradition that, with this romantic tradition, he is in a constant dialogue. But what I find actually very interesting about this novel is the fact that this act of self-immolation in a very subversive way answers the question whether the subaltern can speak. The protagonist is a writer, but as he says at the beginning of the novel, he has not been writing for years, he has been silent. This was his way of being free. But when he's asked to undertake this act of self-immolation, he believes this is like his last day on earth, and then this act is a way for him to finally speak. And I believe this is actually what he does, again, a very hybrid operation. Why hybrid? Because on the one hand, there is this like deconstructed but still present romantic ethos of self-offering. But on the other hand, as we know, the answer to the question, can the subaltern speak, is usually yes, but only in the epistemic framework of the colonizer. What is the epistemic framework of the colonizer? In this case, as the Poland is supposed to be incorporated into the Soviet Union, it's simply the destruction of the subaltern, erasing it. So basically, this self-destruction, the self-immolation, the self-violence is basically here just like hybrid wave of both like saying no, but also, unfortunately, as it usually is in colonial situation, kind of like taking on this epistemic framework of the colonizer, but it's also the only way to like protest against the plans of the colonizer. And this is where I think this like tragedy of this protagonist from this novel comes from. And yeah, now I should be finishing because the time is up, and I should somehow conclude this whole thing. But yeah, it was supposed to be like eclectic. Maybe it wasn't the worst. And basically, what I wanted to do here was like to present certain conceptualization, not to like synthesize the topic, as I said. And maybe for some people it was like inspiring to undertake this question in the future. Thank you.
Thank you for your very interesting presentation and for keeping time. It's very important. We have a next presentation. Next presentations will be presented by Dr. Aleksandra Naróg from Jagiellonia University in Kraków. Please. Aleksandra Naróg graduated from interdisciplinary individual studies and humanities at the Jagiellonia University in Kraków, and defends her doctoral dissertation on the works of Witold Gombrowicz. She currently preparing some publication and currently work on the grant project Potential Histories of East Central Europe at the center, at the Research Center for Memory Cultures at the Jagiellonia University in Kraków. She also published many interesting articles dedicated especially Witold Gombrowicz and other Polish writers like Bruno Schulz. Aleksandra will be talking about the Witold Gombrowicz in Berlin, Postcolonial Perspective. Please, Agata, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much and welcome. Yes, my presentation, Witold Gombrowicz in Berlin, Postcolonial, is entitled Postcolonial Perspectives. And I use the plural just to, of course, show that in 20 minutes we cannot afford one general perspective, more like ideas, and with possibly no one clear conclusion. What would be postcoloniality in the terms of Gombrowicz's stay in Berlin? I wanted to show some remarks, possibly some ideas, and just to briefly talk about 1 year from Gombrowicz's life, which was very much into political engagement, which wasn't maybe that typical for him, as he wrote about. But he wrote it in diary about being himself pretending to be a apolitical writer. As we saw yesterday and one day before during many presentations, it could be a good strategy, and of course a good strategy while talking about Gombrowicz, to start a presentation from a joke, especially when talking about Gombrowicz. But I think my opinion is that he himself would consider his 1 year stay in Berlin as a somehow bitter, somehow tragic joke of the history, and how his own fate as a writer, because he spoke many times about some fate, some assumptions about his life, the way, the linear way of his life was based on many presumptions and some fate, so that the history often played jokes with him. I wouldn't, of course, and possibly you know the works of Gombrowicz very well, and I don't have time here to present it. I just wanted to mention that as Gombrowicz was born in 1904 and he was dead in 1969, it's 65 years of life, from which he spent 24 years in Argentina on emigration and 6 years and a half in France, short time in Paris, then in Vence. So only about 30, and 30 is significant for Gombrowicz as the figure of Józio from 30 Durka being the 30, but only around 30 years of his life was spent in Poland. That's why Gombrowicz's figure and Gombrowicz's work is perfect for both post-colonial, transcultural analysis, but also from an analysis from a perspective of reception. And one thing I wanted to point out when I'm thinking about the German reception of Gombrowicz, work. I have this book in Polish translation. This book about Gombrowicz in the eyes of the German critics is called Patagonian in Berlin. Not a Pole in Berlin, a nobleman in Berlin or somehow, but nor is not Argentinian, it's Patagonian. So the first step of somehow orientalization, but also using the figure of Patagonian, not Argentinian. So the culture, which in the foreword to the German edition of diary is written directly to be inferior not only to German, European, but also Polish culture. That Argentinian culture, Gombrowicz came from 30 years in Argentina, from a Argentinian culture, which is inferior not only to the European Western culture in all, but also to Polish culture. And from today's perspective, it would be very crucial to analyze how the transcultural networks and how both cultures which are dominant and subdominant, and the case of Poland and Argentina, which are inferior in somehow cultures to the model of the Western, can work together. But just to sign quickly the first general problem and the question. Okay, but going further, when talking about Gombrowicz stay in Berlin, we talk about exactly 1 year, from 16th of May 1963 until 17th of May 1964. Gombrowicz gained a scholarship of the American Ford Foundation. It was a significant scholarship, American scholarship for the writers and for the artists, except from Gombrowicz. For example, Ingeborg Bachmann or Aleksandra from the Polish side gained this scholarship called Artist in Residence for a 1 year stay, and of course a financial support, a stay in West Berlin. But of course, as you know for sure, the time of that scholarship is also significant because it had a strong political meaning. To about one year after the foundation of the Berlin Wall, to show the potential of the art in West Berlin and to avoid its loneliness in the field of Europe, to unite somehow the picture of Berlin from the American perspective in the eyes of the world. And what is also very, very crucial, Gombrowicz agreed as one of the first Polish writer approved to go to Europe and to take this scholarship. But what is extremely significant, after his previous 24-year stay in Argentina, and he considered this in a diary mostly as his only chance, his fate, as a fate which is going to come, as I said before, to the only chance to go back to Europe. That's the first point, but to Europe, but to Poland. That was the thing he was considering all the time during his stay in Argentina. Would it be possible for him to come back to Poland, even see Poland after his 24-year exile? Because as you for sure remember, he traveled on the transatlantic robbery in 1939, so shortly 1 month before the outbreak of the Second World War. He didn't know while entering the ship if he will be going there just for a kind of touristic, journalistic cruise for 3 weeks or even more. He didn't know, even in his early pre-assumptions, that he will stay in Argentina for 24 years because of the outbreak of the Second World War, and that he will spend almost half of his life there. So because of the financial reasons, because Gombrowicz's situation in Argentina was very, very poor due to financial conditions, life conditions, many illnesses, diseases as well. He considered this scholarship as his only chance to go back to Europe, and from the perspective, which would be crucial, from the perspective of West Berlin and through the wall, think about the Poland, but the vision of Poland, the imaginary Poland, potential Poland, I would say, also later, and the possibility to come back. But as we know from his history, he never had a chance to go back to Poland because of many political contexts. I will tell about them in a second. And he came after the stay in Berlin. He traveled to France for the invitation of Jerzy Giedroyć, who helped him, and he finished the last 6 years of his life in the residence in Vence in the southern France. So he never saw Poland behind the wall. It was only imaginary, the potential history. Just to quickly show 3 places, because the places and the context of the city of Berlin, and being thrown into as a category essential from Gombrowicz. He was thrown into Warsaw at the beginning of his life, then thrown for 24 years into Buenos Aires, then in Berlin. Here is the first flat Gombrowicz was offered during his scholarship, Hohenzollern, 36. He stayed there for about 3 months at the first floor. This flat on the corner at the first floor was his first flat. And this modernist architecture, I think, is also crucial here. That from after 24 years in Buenos Aires, he was thrown into modernity, modernism also, and the modern vision of Europe, which he didn't know. He only knew Europe from press, letters from his friends, the imagination. But it's like an experience of being thrown into modernity, but also a city which he considered as very large, sterile in some kind of way, which he compared with Buenos Aires all the time. But I will show some examples in a second. The second flat, and the most famous one, and also the flat where Gombrowicz spent most of his time in Berlin, it was Bartningallee in Hansa district. So around 8 months of his stay. His flat is the one here, that one on the corner. Later on, what is interesting, it was generally a flat, a residence for more artists coming to Berlin using the scholarships. For example, for the Polish director Konrad Swinarski, he took this flat after Gombrowicz, and I will come back also to the history of Swinarski and his wife, which is also a crucial turning point for Gombrowicz history in Berlin. But again, this modern architecture and the flat where Gombrowicz spent most of his time in Berlin, and also what can we read in Kronos, for example, had a very dynamic, vivid, erotic life, for example, with many homosexual, short-term relationships and so on. So this is the second place. And yeah, and also in what is related to the place we are here now, to Pilecki Institute, but also of the actions and memory politics of the Polish government. Here is the memory table, which was founded in 2021. Excuse me. Unfortunately, it was time of COVID outbreak, so it wasn't that large event that it was planned to be. But anyway, there is a plaque where information that Gombrowicz lived in that flat is written both in Polish and in German. And here is a short excerpt you probably know about from his diary, Berliner Notizen, so from his diary, or it was in English diary Paris Berlin, when he describes a view from his window, but also a park, a center of Berlin. But what is the most crucial and the most important, the view on the wall. That from this flat at the very upper floor, he sees the wall and the potential Eastern Europe, the potential Poland, and just the imaginary view of Eastern Berlin. Also, in the same year, from the perspective of memory politics, there was an exhibition co-funded and co-organized as well by Pilecki Institute, showing some pictures about Gombrowicz, and the most famous pictures and excerpts from his works and from his life. And what is important, the main point of this exhibition was to make it extremely approachable from the perspective of the city, that the people living in this district, just passing by, just see many faces, many visions of Gombrowicz from his youth to the death. So just a short digression. And the third picture, the third thing, Fuggerstrasse 23, where former Hygieia clinic, Gombrowicz spent there 2 months because of the illness, but it was a consequence. It was said as to be the consequences of the flu, but mostly it was due to his very poor health state, even after Argentina, but also of the political context. I will tell during next steps of my presentation. So 2 months of his stay, he was in hospital in a very poor state. Yeah, and I already used this title in German, Berliner Notizen, so Diary Paris, Berlin, where Gombrowicz wrote, "The munificence of enormous waters whipped into eternity which divided me from European history. And then suddenly a return, the move to Europe, and this into a place this is more bespattered with history than ever, but into the most painful place." So it shows in general the whole Berliner Notizen, the whole excerpt, the very harsh experience Gombrowicz turned up during his one year stay. The experience of pain, the experience of being not understood well, and the perspective of the people, the man from Argentina who was thrown into the very center of the European history. And just to quickly show the ideas, of course, of cross-cutting identities, Gombrowicz, the Polish writer, but living in Argentina, considering himself as Argentinian in Berlin. So that's I would interpret this figure as in a terms of cross-cutting identities, transculturality, of course, according to Wolfgang Welsch, and also potential history. How could history be seen from the perspective of the flat in Western Berlin, how the East is seen, how the history could turn out different, according to Ariela Azoulay, or invented Eastern Europe from Larry Wolff. This is the place from where Gombrowicz starts with, and he considers himself as the Argentinian. He writes about himself, me, the Argentinian. Another paradox. What he writes more. In Berlin, however, the incompleteness of existence, allowing for a mirage, fata morgana, perversity, and other abuses, with which I had to deal so many times in Poland, in Argentina, had in itself all the seriousness of German technique and labor. Trust in God, not in your dreams. Perhaps they were not so very real, but they were becoming real. Real, therefore, in their effect, but are real in their existence. So still, the experience of unreality, potentiality, more like the vision than the real existence of the history will be the most crucial there. Also, the famous excerpt, maybe I won't read it now, but excerpt about walking in the Tiergarten Park near to Gombrowicz's place, when he faces first with the smell that reminds him, but only reminds him in a potential way, of the smell of the trees, the parks in Poland, but also the vision of death. That cycle was coming to a close, the finishing life, and the cycle which is coming to the end. So again, the Poland, but from the mirror of the perspective of the park in Germany. Again, the potential history. Just two more quotations. I think I will point out to I know we're going slowly to the end, but I just wanted to point out just for those two sentences from the diary. As a Pole, I waited on their conscience, the German conscience. They felt guilty, writes Gombrowicz about the Germans. So he imagines himself a situation of Germany after the Second World War. The feeling, the affective dimension is crucial here. The feeling of guilt, and also treating himself like a person from Argentina. He also shows Argentina as a place of a different way of perceiving history, experience, and the feeling that Berlin, like Lady Macbeth, this is the famous excerpt, endlessly washing his hands. So the feeling of guilt read through the literary figure of Lady Macbeth, the hands that also appear in further excerpts of notes from Berlin. and the potentiality of the deaf, the history of that he didn't see from the point of Europe, but from Argentina, which is still potential and imaginatory. Also, another excerpt that shows this perspective is the looking out from the window and thinking about the cemetery in East Berlin with the grave of Hegel. And someone else put a hand on my shoulder, and this was brotherly, but fraternity from over there was deaf. Another excerpt from diary showing this potentiality. I don't know how much time I have left. Can I have just 2 minutes, because I know we're shortly out of time. All right. Another one more place I wanted to point out. Unfortunately, it doesn't exist anymore on Kurfürstendamm. Was the former Café Zunz. Is the picture from 1963. And I would like just to quickly show the fact of Gombrowicz's idea of transfer of the perspective of artistic life from Warsaw, Café Ziemiańska, where he spent most of his time in Warsaw before the war, and Buenos Aires Café Rex, which became the main point of his meetings with his friends, where also Ferdydurke was translated into Spanish. It's another fascinating case, but it's not the topic of these lectures. Just 2 comments of Ginter Grass, who met Gombrowicz once in this cafe, and from Gombrowicz. What Grass said about the figure of Gombrowicz here, Gombrowicz who wanted to recreate his writer's table in Zunz. Gombrowicz attended such meetings often, as if for fun, which was probably the result of partly from his Argentinian habits and the Latin concept of the writer's profession. So it's fascinating, yeah, that the Polish writer, from the perspective of Grass, gains the Latin perspective, which is not true for Buenos Aires, but it's also another topic that Argentinians, for example, consider Gombrowicz as a person who show how to sit in cafes in a French, European way. Another paradox, yeah. But that's how Grass talks about the failure of the concept of transferring the ideas of Ziemiańska and Rex into Berlin. And Gombrowicz also was very disappointed about these meetings. They finished after, I don't know, 3 or 4 months, so with no success. The idea of creating an artistic space for the transfer of thought. There was a general skepticism regarding any direct contact, not within the framework of a specific assignment. Their eyes met, but always about something, never in the way that eyes look deeply into other eyes. So lack of contact, the idealization also of Argentinian way of thinking about art, treating art, so the general misunderstatement. And also, just finishing, I don't have time to, of course, tell about everything, but the quotation from the diary, like Europe, the problem of language, of course, as Gombrowicz considered Europe as a tower of Babel. He didn't speak German, so it was because of his general problems with German. He spoke French and Spanish, but not English and German. So those problems in Zunz were possibly a result of just a simple lack of knowledge of the language. But this sentence I will just point out into the end. I saw the malice I am talking about when a certain official invited me to supper. Even once in a while, they turned to me pleasantly, but it always ended in mimicry. And I added Homi Baba's name in this place to analyze the concept of mimicry, the very, very typical postcolonial concept, like Gombrowicz as a figure of Pole, Argentinian, I don't know, who needs to create a mimicry, so a strategy of surviving against the dominant European and German culture. And just to quickly finish, the political thing, which became the most problematic for Gombrowicz during his stay, the one meeting that ended somehow his chances to visit Poland, to visit Europe, and which ended his career in Polish People's Republic as well. In 1963, he was about to meet Polish director Konrad Swinarski, but Swinarski was a bit afraid to meet Gombrowicz, who he said, I don't know who it is, this writer lives in Argentina, maybe somehow dangerous, I don't know how would it finish. So Swinarski sent his wife, Barbara Witek-Swinarska, who was an agent of security service, the Polish security service, and also gained information about not only Gombrowicz, but also many Polish writers. Gombrowicz didn't know about this. So he sent his wife, Barbara Witek, just to meet with him and maybe conduct an interview. This interview about distance, a conversation with a master, was published in Życie Literackie in 1963, but it was a kind of a feuilleton because Swinarska asked Gombrowicz firstly of his perspective about Poland, about the war, and also the understanding of the death of many Poles during the Second World War, and his view about the Germany. So the first problem from the Polish perspective, Polish People's Republic perspective, was that Gombrowicz agreed to gain this scholarship from Germany, and it was connected with the strong anti-German, not only anti-Semitic but anti-German propaganda in Poland in the 60s, of course. Anyway, this interview started with a harsh press campaign about Gombrowicz and allegations of somehow whitewashing Nazi crimes, because Gombrowicz wrote in this expert that Poles in general are exaggerating. It was very much a Gombrowiczian way of. We don't know if he said this directly to Swinarska or not, but whitewashing Nazi crimes and downplaying the victims of Second World War in Poland. And that led to the fact that he wasn't able, as I said before, to visit Poland. And this is just the last picture of Gombrowicz in Berlin airport, photo of his friend Susanna Feltz, Gombrowicz, after 2 years in hospital, leaving Berlin and going to France, never see the Poland, and we see only his back, yeah, and he's still being back to the east side of Berlin, going towards west. Okay, thank you for the additional time. I'm going to finish. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Aleksandra, for a very interesting presentation speech. We are nearly exactly on the time, so we have nearly 25 minutes for discussion. So if you have some, maybe please sit, Aleksandra, maybe could you sit here? So there is a time for question, comments. There is a first question.
Thank you so much for amazing talks. I have like one question for Mrs. Czaja and two questions to Mrs. Naróg. Like the first question concerning Polish Romanticism and its Orientalist and also colonial views on the East, because you used this thesis of Emma Thompson that in case of Eastern Europe it is rather the nationality and not the race. But is it abandoning the race issue really helpful when we consider that how the interactions between, let's say, Polish victims of this deportation to Siberia and Kazakhstan and so on looked like this, those people there were also implementing kind of racist and colonialist policies, which is visible still today. When we think of people of Polish origin living in Kazakhstan today, like they do not support Kazakh independence of Russia, and it's rather pro-Russian, and they repeat this attitude that we were those who bring civilization here to this step. And we were the civilized, and we were out, you know, to live with those barbarians. And if not us, it would be still like another you know, shithole country, to use the unfamous term. So so this is the question about the race. For Ms. Naróg, thank you very much for Gombrowicz talk, and, you know, to make Berlin, like, literary Berlin for us. I have an impression that what is important in this context is first in the Germany intrigue prepared by Secret Service of the Communist Poland is the context that in that time Germany, Western Germany, still didn't accept the post-war borders. That was one issue, and another issue was that it was still the time when Germany haven't reconsidered its Nazi past. It was still the moment when the high-rank Nazis were in the system, and this was like a taboo, wasn't talked about. So one have to admit that it wasn't as if it were like when we think of the anti-German resentments of the former Polish government. It was something that was much deeper. And another issue is this creation of himself as an Argentinian, like that, or Patagonian. I think it's not to be treated as something like self-derogatory or because in before the Second World War and even in post-war, Argentina was much developed than many countries in Europe. Like in Gombrowicz times, Argentina was more prosperous than Italy or Spain. Like it was after Gombrowicz's death when Argentina started to have problems. But even if in transatlantic we see that that's this impression, wow, I came to Buenos Aires and this is something like a big city, that it's nothing comparable with what I've seen. So is it not like, you know, I'm Argentinian, say it with pride and not with this self-derogatory game. Thank you very much, and yeah, I'm curious to hear your comments and answers.
Okay, so I will start with the answering. Basically, like, you put many topics into your question. Let's just unpack it. Firstly, maybe I should have like just noticed in my, said this in my talk, that I will be mostly speaking about this like violence that Poles are experiencing, not the one they are like exercising, because obviously there is, even in this one quotation that I had, there is this motif of Poles orientalizing or even exercising like physical violence towards this native people of Siberia. Even this like name Ostiak that the Słowacki is using there is also already in itself very problematic and orientalizing one. And yeah, obviously it would have been a very nice perspective with this vicious cycle of violence, but I just simply did not have time for it. But yeah, obviously generally all those colonial relations like lead usually to this vicious cycle of violence, that the subaltern is also then exercising some forms of violence on someone else. It's definitely there. But then yeah, again, I didn't have time for that. And secondly, about how it's looking like now of this like emigrations of Poles in Kazakhstan, for example, I actually don't know. And actually this topic has been like at least partially discussed by other people, and I have such a tendency that I don't like to talk about things that other people have talked already about. So there are some works on that. I can even like give you them later.
Yeah, now it works. Oh, all right, yeah. So thank you very much for your comments and the questions. Of course, regarding the first comment, it wasn't that easy. That it was only anti-German propaganda in the 60s in Polish People's Republic. Of course, it was a much larger problem of the unreconciled past of the Germany, and the question of the guilt. And what is important here here is somehow how Gombrowicz, from the perspective of a total different country like Argentina, felt in somehow affective way, because of course he corresponded with many friends in Poland and in France, so he knew the situation somehow, but he mostly felt it. And what he writes about the feeling of guilt in the air if Germany, those imaginatory pictures of the blood on the hands and so on, is more perceived from affective perspective than rationally organized. Maybe that's also the point. But of course you are right, and it's the much larger topic, the whole case of Swinarska and how it is it's thrown into the whole network of political elements. Yeah. So that's the first point. But thank you as well for the second question and the second comment about the relation of power, inferiority of cultures, and especially Argentinian culture. And of course, you are right that from the time of emigration in the 30s, the vision of a city of Buenos Aires, of Argentina, was a vision of prosperity from the economical perspective. For many, Gombrowicz was one of the many emigrants. He emigrated with one wave, one huge wave of immigrants who went to Argentina either from political but also economical reasons. But when talking about literature and the culture, I think it's the more general topic of Argentinian artists considering themselves as a slightly different from Europe, that they didn't have a good pattern. Europe, and especially Paris, French literature became a somehow pattern for a new literature which started in 18th, 19th century. Argentinian society was a young society, and Argentina was for all the time the country in progress, thinking which direction to go, and many dominant patterns, especially a French avant-garde model, for example, in the times of Gombrowicz, came to Buenos Aires, but somehow the feeling of inferiority, the culture which is mimicking the European culture, but not creating his own system, her own system of power. This is the most crucial thing here. And when I started talking about the affective dimension, Gombrowicz, and we can read this in the diary and also the notes about the Berlin. He really missed Argentina in Berlin, so at the beginning of his stay in Europe, and this considering himself is Argentinian was of course it could be paradoxal when talking about Gombrowicz, because he always, as we know, played with masks. When I am in Europe, I say I am an Argentinian. When I am in Argentina, I play a Polish nobleman, so it's a strategy. But also when we finish with the paradigm of Gombrowicz, the player using masks, reading directly the excerpts from diary shows that he missed his friends in Argentina very much, but also a way of doing art, I would say, in meeting in cafes, being free, and also playing with the somehow inferior Argentinian culture, playing this Polish nobleman who shows his Argentinian friends how to behave in cafes, how to play with paradox, to be intellectually free, and so on and so on. So from my point of view, it could be more complex, but maybe for the next discussion as well. But thank you.
Have you? Yeah. Okay. Another question?
Yeah, thank you. I'm really intrigued by the two presentations by the expert discussion of Gombrowicz and this violence in relationship to post-colonial. There's a connection here, and I wonder if we need to think more about violence in connection to post-colonialism. Because if we think about violence, it's in contrast to power. As Hannah Arendt put it, then violence can, I think I looked up the quote now, violence always rises out of impotence. It is the hope of those who have no power to find a substitute for it. And this hope, I think, is in vain. Violence can destroy power, but it can never replace it. So power, if we turn to Michel Foucault, is more of a capillary way of constructing and mitigating and influencing us. So when we think about the violence in a text, or through the text that we as a reader are able to access, shouldn't we be more thoughtful and reflective about how we are bringing in our experiences into understanding this violence, especially in the context of post-colonial perspectives in literature, where we're talking about a second-order phenomena. We're not talking about the first-order experience. We're talking about the second-order presentation through the literary narrative. And finally, the third order, if you will, experience and engagement with the text to understand those factors. So is violence perhaps something far more, not we want to simplify it to it, but in a text, this textual violence is perhaps something very, very distant from power. And the relationship to power would be actually, I think, something that would be very, very interesting in the context of post-colonial studies to explore more carefully, as I think your considerations, Ms. Naróg, at the end about the various forms of transcultural incompleteness open up a window to think about the incompleteness of all human existence, not just those people who have transcultural lives or are dominated by their transcultural experiences. So it's a comment, but there's a question. If you have any thoughts, I'd be really keen, because you work so closely with these texts and this body, these corpuses of material from these people. I would wonder if you had any thoughts about that.
Right, so thank you very much for this comment and for general perspective, and yes, the perspective which was quoted of pain, of violence strictly into the text is visible in whole Gombrowicz's diary and also his other works, the novels. The violence which is often maybe not necessary, even with no deeper sense, like Gombrowicz, for example, memorizing his early years in Poland when he attended to school, and in a group of some younger guys, they did a violent play with the frog, throwing out frog's legs, for example. And this is of course the picture of the figure being socialized or unsocialized, how the group creates herself in the context of sociology. Of course, we can consider this, but this inferiority and the question how also in the term of language, violence and pain can be visible in the text. When I'm thinking about pain, is of course also the case of Kronos, which shows the bare experience of pain. But for sure, this, as you mentioned, as you said before, it opened a large field for the possible analysis from sociological perspective as well. How violence creates a relation between two people, which is a basis from Gombrowicz, a form, but also when we go further, the relation and also the political relationship between the communities, between the pairs, communities, and the nations. And this is the crucial point for Gombrowicz's work, of course, for sure, from this perspective. Yeah, thank you for that. This gave me a food for thought. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Okay. Yeah. Have you any questions or comments?
Maybe a comment. Thank you for the inspiring papers. I'm thinking about it, and for the question about Poland that has its double role as a colonizer and being colonized, but not at the same time. And it is a very interesting perspective, because we can take the person in Kazakhstan who said something in 20th century and compare it with it later 200 years before. But it is inspiring because subalternizing Poland is maybe not it's maybe too much, but we had these periods of being subalterned in this partition time and in the communism, so that's why you have chosen these poets and writers to show this concept. So they're very interesting. Thank you.
Actually, my answer to this comment would be actually in different, I mean, I would say actually Poland was a hegemon, or at least was a subaltern, and was also orientalizing and colonizing others, I would say in the same time, at least narratively, because when we read Prelekcje paryskie of Mickiewicz, actually there we obviously have this situation, this whole messianic ideology that is, for me, basically this like anti-colonial, decolonial like struggle of creating a national identity under this hegemony, that also with like free hegemons and so on, but also then Mickiewicz on the other hand is, for example, very strongly like orientalizing and basically not accepting a certain otherness, just like simply the fact that Ukrainians, Belarusians are maybe not Poles for him, those are simply some maybe more oriental variations of Polishness. So I would say it is actually happening in case of Poland sometimes at the same time, and this is what makes it so complicated to actually methodologically somewhat grasp it. Thank you.
Okay, any question, comments? We have 5 minutes.
Perhaps one question to Gombrowicz. I remember that he was very connected to Jean Genet, but he always denied this openly. And I remember that I read in Jean Genet that he was with his, I think it was Croatian friend in Katowice, stealing money from the churches and being in a prison. And so this total outsider provoking in principle all kind of power. And so you would always think that when Gombrowicz comes to Berlin, where the intellectual would now start to try to be more democratic after this horrible autocratic past, that in principle should have fascinated him. But of course, a person talking so strange, like an aristocrat from Lithuania, behaving like a total stranger, that's so crazy for me to understand why he. But obviously, you said it already. This mask play, because there was Hubert Fichte, who then went to Brasilia. He could met him, or Johann Jan, also very elitarian gay. But of course, he only went into the Tiergarten around Hanseviertel for cruising. Obviously, why did he not go more into all these people? He would. There were so many people he could do wonderful things, but he ignored it. I never understood this with Gombrowicz. Would you have an answer to this? We really never understood.
I'm not sure. We should ask Gombrowicz maybe. But regarding Jeanette, there is a great book by Piotr Severin Ross. So I'm not sure if it is or it would be translated into English or German, but it's Gombrowicz Jeanette, a love story, the story of fascination, which was also from this perspective of affect, but also a transcultural meeting. Could be very, very powerful to read it through this perspective. Why did Gombrowicz not enter directly? He tried to. He was even during his stay in Berlin. He was, for example, invited to perform a lecture for the auditory of the students, invited by one of his friends, one professor. But this lecture, of course, it's a whole creation. When he describes it in Berlin notes that he was asked just to sit and read the excerpts of Verdedurke. And when he was asked during this lecture to do this, he just denied. He wrote that the language in his tongue, in his mouth, it sounds so strange that he just couldn't, you know, get into this very, very strict form, even though he was treated by the students with enthusiasm. They knew Ferdedorke, they read it, but he didn't feel well in this form, which he considered. I'm not saying it was like that, but he considered the form of German society as somehow strict, and without, as I said, he missed Argentina, without the somehow spirit of rebellion, but also the spirit that he was treated in Argentina like, oh, a strange figure, a nobleman from Poland. So a case of playing the role somehow, which he commented that Argentinians like the way of acting between people. And in Germany, when in Café Zunz, for example, he was acting, he considered that himself as treated with misunderstatement. It's a general problem because, of course, it's those are the notes of diary. It's also somehow a creation, but a creation about thinking, about being himself in between various nations. During his whole stay in Argentina, he of course criticized Argentina, but when he came to Berlin, to Europe, now suddenly it became a very positive pattern. He idealized it. Yeah, so. It's not that consequent, of course, and the spirit of provocation and the play for all the time, for sure, yeah. But Ingeborg Bachmann shared. She was his friend during this stay in Berlin. They walked together around Tiergarten in Berlin and just felt they shared the feeling of West Berlin as a strange place, that something is happening, but we don't know what, and that our experience is not full in that place. That's still something going on. So, of course, it's a problem.
Okay, we are exactly on the time, so this is the time to close this morning session. Thanks for the speakers for very interesting talks, and thanks to all for very interesting discussion. We have a coffee break. Maybe, Lucas, do you have some organizational information?
Yeah, we have a coffee break, and I'd ask you to return at 10:50 for the next session here in the conference room. Enjoy and thank you.